The flight deck was burning. Japanese aircraft were disappearing into the smoke while wounded sailors stumbled across twisted steel, ammunition crews fought to keep the guns firing, and aircraft still tried to land on a carrier that looked as though it had already been mortally wounded. Explosions shook the deck. Flames climbed toward the sky. Somewhere below, men were racing through corridors filling with smoke, searching for ruptured fuel lines and damaged machinery before one spark could turn the entire ship into an inferno. Then another aircraft appeared. For a few seconds, nobody knew whether it was friend or enemy. The carrier's guns swung toward it. Men waited for the order to fire. But the aircraft was American and it was coming home. The landing signal flashed through the smoke. Somehow the deck crew cleared a path. The battered machine touched down, bounced, and finally stopped. Around it, the carrier continued fighting. She had already been bombed. She had already been battered. She had already survived battles that had destroyed other American carriers. Yet she was still moving, still launching aircraft, still sending men into combat. And somewhere beyond the smoke, Japanese commanders were trying to solve a problem that had become increasingly difficult to explain. How many times could one American carrier be hit before it finally disappeared? The answer would become one of the most extraordinary stories of the Pacific War. Because this was not a brand new supercarrier protected by layers of modern technology. She was a Yorktown-class carrier commissioned in 1938, built before the United States entered World War II, and by the middle of the war she had already endured years of combat. Her name was USS Enterprise. Her sailors called her Big E. And despite everything thrown at her, she refused to leave the Pacific. But the ship's story had begun long before the first bombs fell. In the 1930s, the United States Navy was preparing for a war nobody could yet predict. Japan was expanding across Asia. Germany was rearming in Europe. American planners understood that any future Pacific conflict would be fought across distances so enormous that battleships alone could not control them. Aircraft carriers were becoming the eyes, fists, and mobile airfields of naval warfare. Instead of relying entirely on guns with ranges measured in miles, a carrier could launch aircraft hundreds of miles away, allowing a fleet to strike an enemy it could not even see. The United States needed carriers capable of carrying large air groups while surviving the harsh conditions of Pacific operations. Enterprise was authorized under the Naval Expansion Act of 1933, laid down at Newport News Shipbuilding in Virginia on July 16, 1934, launched on October 3, 1936, and commissioned on May 12, 1938. She was the 7th U.S. Navy vessel to carry the name Enterprise. Nobody standing on the dock that day could have known what was coming. The ship was over 800 feet long, carried thousands of sailors and airmen, and operated aircraft that were primitive compared with the machines that would dominate the later years of the war. Her aircraft included fighters, scout planes, and torpedo and dive bombers, each with different missions and different weaknesses. The carrier herself was not invulnerable. No aircraft carrier was. Her survival depended on speed, maneuver, armor, damage control teams, aircraft, escorts, and something less tangible, the ability of thousands of people to keep functioning when everything around them was collapsing. That would soon become the defining characteristic of Enterprise. In 1939, she was ordered to the Pacific. 2 years later, she was operating from Hawaii as tensions with Japan reached the breaking point. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor began, but Enterprise was not inside the harbor. She was at sea, returning from a mission to deliver Marine fighters to Wake Island. At dawn, Task Force 8 was approximately 215 miles west of Oahu. The carrier's aircraft were already being sent toward Hawaii when reports of the attack began arriving. The men aboard Enterprise had expected to return to Pearl Harbor. Instead, they were entering a war that had just begun. The Japanese had struck the American Pacific Fleet with devastating force. Battleships burned in the harbor. Aircraft were destroyed on the ground. Men who had expected another ordinary morning suddenly found themselves fighting for survival. Enterprise's aircraft searched for the enemy, but the Japanese fleet had already withdrawn. There was no dramatic duel between carriers that day. There was only confusion, uncertainty, and the realization that the United States had entered a war in which the Pacific Ocean itself would become a battlefield. 10 days after Pearl Harbor, Enterprise's aircraft helped sink a Japanese submarine. Then came a series of raids across the Pacific. The carrier struck Japanese positions in the Marshall Islands, attacked Wake Island, and raided Marcus Island. Each mission taught her crews the same lesson: the Pacific was too vast for mistakes. A carrier could disappear beneath the horizon in minutes, and aircraft could spend hours searching for targets before fuel became the greatest enemy of all. But then came a mission that would turn Enterprise into part of one of the most audacious operations of the entire war. In April 1942, she helped cover the Doolittle Raid, the American operation that sent B-25 bombers from USS Hornet toward Japan. Enterprise provided fighter protection and reconnaissance support while the task force crossed the Pacific under extreme secrecy. The bombers eventually launched after the force was discovered earlier than planned. Their attack caused limited physical damage compared with later Pacific battles, but its psychological impact was enormous. Japan had been struck at home. The war was no longer something that could be fought only on distant islands. The Japanese leadership now had another problem. American carriers were still alive, and one of them was beginning to appear again and again. Enterprise. But nobody yet understood how important that would become. By the spring of 1942, the Pacific balance had changed dramatically. Japan had captured huge territories and destroyed much of the American battleship force at Pearl Harbor, but the carrier war was different. American and Japanese fleets could strike each other without ever seeing the opposing ships. The decisive weapon was not the ship's guns. It was the aircraft launched from the deck. Then intelligence gave American commanders an opportunity. Japanese forces were preparing to attack Midway Atoll, a strategic American position west of Hawaii. Admiral Chester Nimitz knew that the coming battle could determine whether Japan continued its expansion or whether the United States could finally begin pushing back. Enterprise sailed with the American carrier force. The Japanese arrived with 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, along with a powerful supporting force. Their plan depended on surprise, coordination, and the assumption that American carriers could be overwhelmed. But American codebreakers had helped reveal the target. On June 4, 1942, aircraft from Enterprise and the other American carriers began attacking. The battle quickly descended into confusion. Torpedo bombers flew low toward Japanese carriers and suffered terrible losses. Fighters battled overhead. Dive bombers searched for targets. Squadrons became separated. Fuel ran low. Radio communication was imperfect. Pilots were trying to find enemy carriers in a vast ocean while knowing that their own carriers could be under attack at any moment. Then the situation changed in minutes. American dive bombers arrived over the Japanese carrier force at a devastating moment. Japanese flight decks were crowded with aircraft and fuel. Bombs struck. Fires erupted. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were mortally damaged. Hiryu later launched counterattacks and managed to damage Yorktown, but American aircraft eventually found Hiryu as well. By the end of the battle, for Japanese fleet carriers had been destroyed. Enterprise had played a central role. The Japanese advance had been stopped. The Pacific War had entered a new phase. Yet the victory came at a terrible cost. Enterprise's crews had witnessed aircraft disappear into the sea and men fail to return. The carrier had survived, but the battle had demonstrated something terrifying. Even the strongest fleet could be crippled within minutes. And Enterprise was about to discover just how close that danger could come. The next battlefield was Guadalcanal. In August 1942, American Marines landed on the island, beginning a campaign that would become one of the bloodiest struggles of the Pacific. The objective was not simply another island. It was Henderson Field, an airfield that could threaten Japanese supply lines and provide the Allies with a base from which to challenge Japanese control of the region. Enterprise supported the campaign. Japanese forces responded with increasing strength. On August 24th, the Battle of the Eastern Solomons erupted. Japanese aircraft found Enterprise. Bombs fell through the sky. One struck the carrier's flight deck and others followed. The ship shook violently. Aircraft were destroyed. Fires broke out. Men were killed and wounded. Yet damage control parties moved toward the wreckage while flight operations continued. Enterprise was damaged badly enough to require repairs, but the battle had revealed something extraordinary. A carrier could be damaged and still fight. The question was how much punishment the crew could absorb before the ship became useless. The answer would be tested again only 2 months later. October 26, 1942. The Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. Enterprise was again under attack. Japanese aircraft came in waves. Bombs struck the ship. Near misses hammered the hull with underwater shock. Flight deck operations became a struggle against smoke, fire, twisted metal, and damaged equipment. Yet aircraft continued to launch and recover. The ship survived, but the damage was serious. Enterprise was sent away for repairs. Her sister carriers had also suffered heavily, and that created a terrifying situation for the American forces around Guadalcanal. The Japanese still had powerful naval forces in the region. The Marines on Guadalcanal still needed support, and the number of available American fleet carriers was rapidly shrinking. Then came the moment that transformed Enterprise from an important carrier into a symbol. In November 1942, she returned to the South Pacific despite the damage she had suffered. She was the only available American fleet carrier in the area. The naval battle of Guadalcanal was approaching. Japanese warships were moving toward the island, and American commanders knew that if the Japanese could reinforce their troops and destroy American naval forces, the campaign could collapse. Enterprise's aircraft went into action. The ship herself remained a floating target surrounded by ocean. There was nowhere to hide. Her aircraft had to find the enemy first. When American planes struck Japanese ships, they helped damage and destroy vessels that were part of the Japanese effort to reinforce Guadalcanal. The battle became a brutal contest of aircraft, cruisers, battleships, destroyers, submarines, and exhausted crews fighting through darkness and confusion. Enterprise had been damaged repeatedly, but her aircraft were still in the fight. Her presence mattered. Her crews knew that if the carrier disappeared, the Americans would lose one of the few remaining platforms capable of projecting air power across the region. That was the real secret of Enterprise's survival. It wasn't that the ship couldn't be sunk. She absolutely could. She had no magical armor. No impossible engineering trick protected her from bombs. Her survival came from thousands of sailors who refused to let damage become destruction. Firefighters fought flames while explosions continued around them. Engineers repaired machinery while the ship was still under threat. Deck crews moved aircraft around craters and twisted steel. Pilots launched into combat knowing they might never see the carrier again. And commanders kept the ship moving because stopping could make her an easier target. Enterprise survived the Guadalcanal campaign and received the Presidential Unit Citation for her 1942 service. But the war had not finished with her. Far from it. The Japanese had learned that the American carriers were becoming more dangerous, and Enterprise was becoming one of the most recognizable names in the Pacific. Every time she appeared, Japanese aircraft had a reason to attack. Every time she disappeared for repairs, American commanders wanted her back as quickly as possible. By late 1943, the war had begun shifting toward the Central Pacific. Enterprise participated in operations against the Gilbert and Marshall Islands, supporting amphibious assaults and striking Japanese positions. The carrier was no longer simply fighting for survival. The American Navy was beginning to take the offensive across the Pacific. But the new phase of the war brought another transformation. Enterprise was entering an era in which the aircraft carrier would become the center of American naval power. Her aircraft could attack Japanese bases, ships, airfields, and troop concentrations hundreds of miles away. Her crews were becoming more experienced. Her tactics were improving. And the United States was launching new carriers at a speed Japan could not match. The Japanese could replace some ships. They could not replace experienced pilots nearly as easily. Every major carrier battle was draining Japan's trained air crews. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 made that imbalance brutally clear. American carrier aircraft destroyed enormous numbers of Japanese aircraft, and the battle became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Enterprise participated in the operation, contributing to the growing American control of the Pacific. The carrier that had once been fighting simply to stay alive was now part of a fleet powerful enough to overwhelm Japanese naval aviation. Then came Leyte Gulf in October 1944, one of the largest naval battles in history. Enterprise's aircraft joined the attacks as American forces returned to the Philippines. Japanese naval forces attempted a massive counterattack designed to disrupt the invasion. The fighting spread across enormous distances, and carrier aircraft attacked ships far beyond the range of the carrier's guns. By this point, Enterprise had become more than a ship. She was a mobile airfield, intelligence platform, strike base, fighter station, and command center moving through a war zone that stretched across thousands of miles. But another danger was coming, and it was unlike anything Enterprise had faced before. In late 1944 and 1945, she began operating with specialized aircraft for night missions. Her crews were entering darkness where radar, navigation, and timing became as important as bombs and guns. Then the Japanese introduced a weapon designed around desperation itself. The kamikaze. Instead of trying to survive a bombing run and escape, pilots deliberately turned their aircraft into missiles aimed at American ships. The psychological effect was terrifying. A conventional attacker wanted to live. A kamikaze did not. Enterprise now faced aircraft whose pilots were willing to crash directly into her deck. The first major kamikaze damage came in 1945. During the Okinawa campaign, A Japanese aircraft struck the ship on April 11th. The impact killed and wounded sailors and damaged the flight deck. Yet the ship continued operating. Less than 2 months later, another kamikaze would hit her with far greater consequences. May 14, 1945. The war was approaching its final months, but Enterprise was still in combat. A Japanese aircraft penetrated the defenses and struck the carrier. The damage was severe enough that Enterprise had to return to the United States for repairs. For the first time, the carrier's wartime journey was effectively over. She had been attacked repeatedly across years of combat. She had survived bombs and near misses in multiple battles. She had operated around Guadalcanal, Midway, the Marianas, Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. She had been damaged in 6 separate engagements, but remarkably she had never been struck by a Japanese torpedo. And that detail explains why the phrase, "the ship that could not be sunk," became attached to her. It was never a literal claim. Enterprise was not unsinkable. She simply survived circumstances that could have ended the careers of other ships. Her damage control crews became legendary because they repeatedly turned disasters into temporary emergencies. The ship's survival was a human achievement as much as an engineering one. But there was another extraordinary chapter still waiting. While Enterprise was undergoing repairs in the United States, Japan surrendered in August 1945. The war that had consumed her entire adult life was suddenly over. The ship that had been built during peacetime had spent nearly the entire Pacific War in action. Now her crews were coming home. Enterprise participated in Operation Magic Carpet, helping transport American servicemen back across the Pacific and Atlantic. The carrier that had once carried aircraft into combat was now carrying men home. There was something almost surreal about it. The same decks that had been covered in smoke and wreckage were now crowded with soldiers and sailors who simply wanted to see their families again. The war had ended, but Enterprise's story still wasn't finished. On November 1, 1945, Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal recommended preserving the ship as a national memorial, recognizing the extraordinary role she had played. President Harry Truman approved the recommendation. The idea was simple: keep Enterprise as a monument to the men who had fought aboard her. But history had one final twist. Keeping an aging wartime carrier alive was enormously expensive. The ship required repairs. A suitable berth had to be created. Moving her to Washington would have required major logistical work. Engineers estimated the cost at roughly $1 million, and the preservation plan eventually collapsed under financial pressure. Enterprise was decommissioned on February 17, 1947. For a ship that had survived the Pacific War, retirement should have been the peaceful ending. Instead, she entered a slower battle, one against budgets, changing technology, and the passage of time. In 1956, a Navy inspection declared her unfit for further naval service. The following year, she was sold for scrap. On August 21, 1958, tugs moved the old carrier toward the breakers. The ship that had survived Pearl Harbor's aftermath, Midway, Guadalcanal, Santa Cruz, the Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa was finally defeated by something no Japanese commander had managed to accomplish: economics. By February 1960, the USS Enterprise CV-6 had been cut apart. It is difficult to imagine a more brutal ending for a ship that had become a symbol of American endurance. There would be no preserved carrier waiting for future generations to walk through. No enormous flight deck where veterans could point to the exact place where bombs had exploded. No complete hull rising above a museum pier. Only fragments survived. Artifacts, photographs, pieces of equipment, personal objects, and memories carried by the men who had served aboard her. Yet the ship itself had already become something larger than steel. During World War II, Enterprise earned 20 battle stars, more than any other U.S. ship, along with the Presidential Unit Citation and Navy Unit Commendation. Her aircraft were credited with destroying hundreds of enemy aircraft and sinking or damaging scores of Japanese ships. She participated in nearly every major carrier operation of the Pacific War except the Battle of the Coral Sea. But statistics cannot explain why sailors loved her. A battle star doesn't show the sound of a bomb exploding overhead. It doesn't show a mechanic crawling through smoke to repair a damaged aircraft. It doesn't show a pilot looking down through a cockpit canopy and searching for the carrier that must still be somewhere below. It doesn't show the fear of watching enemy aircraft approach the ship at full speed. And it doesn't show what happened after the battle, when exhausted sailors climbed onto a damaged deck and realized that the ship was still afloat. That is the real story of Enterprise. She was never invincible. She was never immune to bombs. She was never protected by some secret technology that made sinking impossible. Her survival came from design, training, discipline, luck, and the extraordinary resilience of the people aboard her. In the Pacific War, where aircraft carriers could be destroyed within minutes, Enterprise repeatedly survived long enough to fight another day. And every time she returned to combat, she carried the memory of the men who had not returned. Perhaps that is why the nickname Big E became so powerful. It wasn't simply a nickname for a carrier. It became a symbol of endurance during the darkest years of the war. When American forces were still recovering from Pearl Harbor, Enterprise was already striking back. At Midway, she helped turn the tide. At Guadalcanal, she became one of the few remaining American carriers available when the fighting reached its most desperate point. In 1943 and 1944, she helped carry the war toward Japan. In 1945, she survived kamikaze attacks before finally being forced home by damage. She entered the war as a ship built in peacetime. She left it as the most decorated U.S. warship of World War II. And perhaps the strangest part of the story is that her greatest victory was not surviving one particular bomb, one particular battle, or one particular attack. It was surviving long enough to keep returning. That was the difference between Enterprise and the ships that disappeared beneath the Pacific. A carrier could be damaged and still matter. A deck could be burning and still launch aircraft. A ship could lose men, lose planes, lose equipment, and still continue the mission. Enterprise demonstrated that repeatedly until her presence itself became part of American strategy. Japanese forces could sink ships. They could destroy aircraft. They could kill experienced sailors and pilots. But they could not make Enterprise stop fighting. Eventually the war ended. The Pacific became quiet. The aircraft were gone. The guns fell silent. The sailors went home. And the carrier that had once seemed impossible to destroy disappeared piece by piece in a New Jersey scrapyard. Today only fragments remain. An anchor. A helm. Artifacts. Photographs. Names written into records. But the most important part of Enterprise was never the steel. It was the people who kept her alive when the ocean around them was filled with fire. The ship could be repaired. Aircraft could be replaced. Engines could be rebuilt. But the courage required to keep working while bombs were falling could not be manufactured in a shipyard. That had to come from the men themselves. The USS Enterprise CV-6 did not survive because she could not be sunk. She survived because, again and again, the people aboard her refused to let the damage become defeat. And long after the last piece of her hull disappeared, that story remained. Somewhere in the Pacific, beneath thousands of feet of water, lie the ships that could not survive the war. Enterprise is not among them. Her steel is gone. Her flight deck is gone. Her guns are silent. But the name remains. Not because the ship was immortal, but because for 4 brutal years, whenever the Pacific seemed determined to destroy her, she kept coming back. The war eventually defeated nations, shattered fleets, and erased entire generations of ships. But it never managed to erase Big E.